The M60 Minigun, or Savage, as it was soon nicknamed by the men who lugged its formidable weight through the oppressive Vietnamese jungle, was supposed to be an instrument of ultimate dominance. It was a roaring beast of a weapon, spitting lead at a rate that could turn an enemy ambush into a charnel house in seconds. Yet, as Private First Class Arthur Art Jenkins, 19 years old and hailing from a quiet farm in Indiana, discovered, the jungle had a way of mocking even the most sophisticated instruments of war. The year was 1968. The rain, a constant, cloying presence in this godforsaken corner of the world near the Cambodian border, hammered down with a ferocity that seemed determined to wash away not just the red earth, but any semblance of order. Jenkins, his knuckles white as he gripped the savage's hot metal, felt the familiar, sickening stutter begin. Not the steady, devastating roar he'd practiced with until his shoulders ached, but a choked, ragged cough. The roar faltered, sputtered, and died, leaving him and the remnants of his platoon exposed, caught in the sudden, terrifying silence that followed the weapon's failure. They were pinned, the enemy's unseen fire finding them with sickening accuracy. The savage, his supposed shield, had turned traitor, leaving him and the few men he could still see alive under a hail of incoming rounds. He desperately worked the charging handle, the wet metal slick against his sweat-soaked gloves, a primal fear coiling in his gut. Would it restart, or would this be the moment the jungle finally claimed him, the promise of the savage dissolving into the guttural cries of his comrades and the unforgiving downpour? Fort Benning, Georgia, a lifetime ago, or perhaps just yesterday. The air, crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the humid hell that awaited. Art Jenkins, all lanky limbs and a boyish face that hadn't yet been etched by the harsh realities of combat, stood before the savage. It rested on a sandbag, a hulking, metallic serpent gleaming under the Georgia sun. The instructor, a grizzled sergeant with eyes that had seen too much, barked, "This ain't no toy, kid. This is the M60. She weighs 24 pounds loaded. She spits out rounds faster than you can think. You treat her right, she'll make you a god. You don't, she'll get you killed." Jenkins nodded, his hands already itching. He'd always been a tinkerer, his father's farm demanding a constant intimacy with machinery. He ran his calloused fingers over the cool steel, the texture of the oiled metal surprisingly smooth. He took a deep breath, inhaling the pungent, familiar scent of gun oil and cosmoline, a smell that would soon become as ingrained in his memory as the faces of his fallen friends. He cradled the weapon, feeling its substantial weight settle into his shoulder. It was an effort, but a satisfying one, like taming a wild, powerful animal. He worked the charging handle, a solid metallic clack echoing in the otherwise quiet range. He imagined the rounds ripping through paper targets, a satisfying demolition he'd only ever dreamed of. He disassembled it, then reassembled it, his movements becoming more fluid with each repetition. The instructor's voice, a low rumble, followed him. "Every soldier with this weapon, Jenkins, is either a hero or an idiot, sometimes both. Remember that." Jenkins didn't quite understand the paradox then, but the weight of the weapon, the sheer potential for destruction it represented, was intoxicating. He'd already started calling it Savage, a name that felt right, like it understood the raw power it held. He practiced his ritual, the one that would become a silent mantra in the heart of Vietnam. Meticulous cleaning, precise lubrication, a whispered plea to the metal and springs. "Come on, old girl, show 'em what you got." The Ia Drang Valley, November 1965. A name that would forever be whispered in hushed tones in military circles, a crucible where the brutal realities of jungle warfare and the limitations of American firepower collided. Standard infantry units, trained for open field engagements, found themselves utterly unprepared for the savage embrace of the Vietnamese jungle and the cunning tactics of the Viet Cong. The M60, the supposed king of the battlefield, became a liability. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, in his post-action report, would later lament, "We had the firepower, theoretically. But what good is 1,000 rounds a minute when the enemy is on top of you and your ammo bearers have been cut down?" The theory was a clean, well-ordered range, a predictable enemy. The reality was a tangled, suffocating wilderness where visibility was measured in meters, and the enemy moved like phantoms through the dense undergrowth. During one particularly brutal engagement, platoon found itself under heavy assault. They deployed their M60s, the deafening roars temporarily pushing back the attackers. But the supply lines, stretched thin by the unforgiving terrain and the enemy's relentless pressure, couldn't keep pace. As the enemy closed in, their bug-eyed faces appearing through the bamboo thickets, the M60s became useless anchors. Their belts of 100 rounds were depleted in minutes, leaving the soldiers with their M14s outmatched and outgunned. The weight of the deactivated M60s became an unbearable burden, a monument to tactical miscalculation. Moore's report continued starkly. The M60s were left behind, not by choice, by necessity. The ammunition simply wasn't there. We lost good men because a weapon designed to dominate became a dead weight. It was a stark lesson in the unforgiving arithmetic of war. Potential firepower was meaningless without the logistical backbone to sustain it. The M60, a weapon that would define American heavy machine gun capabilities for decades, wasn't born in the heat of battle, but in the sterile environments of engineering labs, a desperate attempt to replicate the success of a proven, albeit enemy, design. The genesis lay in the legendary German MG42, a weapon that had sown terror on the battlefields of World War II with its blistering rate of fire. General Electric engineers, tasked with developing a successor to the M14's squad automatic rifle capabilities, looked across the battlefield and saw the efficiency of the MG42. Their goal, a gas-operated belt-fed machine gun chambered in the standard NATO 7.62 by 51 mm round, capable of delivering sustained suppressive fire. The early prototypes, emerging in the late 1950s, bore a striking resemblance to their German progenitor. They were robust, designed for reliability under harsh conditions, and possessed a savage appetite for ammunition. Initial testing revealed a raw potential, a rate of fire that could be adjusted from a more controlled 950 rounds per minute to an almost uncontrollable 1,100. However, the path to production wasn't without its bumps. Early iterations suffered from overheating issues and a tendency to jam under extreme stress, problems that would dog the weapon's development and, as would become painfully clear, its operational deployment in Vietnam. The engineers strived for a balance between destructive power and battlefield practicality, a delicate equation that the coming conflict would rigorously test. They envisioned a weapon that could pin down an enemy, shatter their morale, and clear the path for advancing infantry. What they couldn't fully anticipate was the sheer, unyielding reality of the Vietnamese landscape, a place where even the most formidable machines could falter. The jungle canopy, usually a suffocating blanket of green, offered little solace from the ceaseless, cloying humidity. Rain, a persistent, uninvited guest in Vietnam, slicked every surface, turning the earth into a treacherous mire. PFC Arthur Art Jenkins, all of 19 years and a world away from the cornfields of Indiana, braced himself against the slick metal of the M60, his knuckles white. The weapon, affectionately and perhaps desperately nicknamed Savage by the men who wrestled with its considerable weight and insatiable hunger for ammunition, was supposed to be a shield, a thunderous equalizer, against the unseen enemy. But now, under the unforgiving downpour on the Cambodian border during Operation Red Mist, Savage was faltering. A choked cough, a metallic stutter, and then silence where there should have been a deafening roar. The enemy, unseen but undeniably present, pressed their advantage. Jenkins fumbled with the feed tray, his sweat-slicked fingers struggling to dislodge a stubborn casing. The sound of incoming fire, sharp and precise, sliced through the air, a terrifying counterpoint to the silence of his weapon. His company was pinned, exposed, and the only thing between them and annihilation was a jam, a mechanical hiccup in a symphony of destruction. He could feel the eyes of his comrades on him, a silent, desperate plea. Could he coax the beast back to life, or would Savage, his monstrous companion, become his tombstone and theirs? Back in the suffocating heat of Fort Benning, Georgia, the M60 was a different animal. Art Jenkins, then a fresh-faced recruit, had approached it with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The drill sergeant, a man whose voice seemed permanently set to a gravely roar, had introduced them to the beast. "This here," he'd barked, gesturing at the hulking weapon with a calloused thumb, "is the M60. She weighs about 23 pounds empty, and she drinks ammo like a sailor on shore leave. You treat her right, she'll spit fire like hell itself. You don't, she'll leave you hung out to dry. Jenkins remembered the sheer physical effort of shouldering the weapon, the way it seemed to pull him down, a physical manifestation of the weight of responsibility. The smell of gun oil and fresh gunpowder was intoxicating, a potent perfume that promised power. He'd run his hands over its cool metal, feeling the intricate mechanics, the promise of 1,000 rounds a minute. His ritual began that day. A meticulous cleaning and lubrication with the issue Savage brand lubricant, a viscous, dark fluid that clung to the bore. He'd whisper to it then, a nervous, almost superstitious incantation. "Come on, old man, show him what you got!" His drill sergeant, an ex-Marine named Sergeant Major Davies, had watched him, a flicker of something unreadable in his steely gaze. "Kid," Davies had said, his voice softer now, almost a growl. "That gun's got more personality than half the men in this battalion. But remember this, she ain't a god. She's a machine, and machines can break." It was a prophecy Jenkins wouldn't fully understand until much, much later when the roaring beast fell silent at the worst possible moment. The crucible of the Iadrang Valley in November 1964 had already etched a brutal lesson into the annals of American infantry warfare, a lesson that the M60, hailed as the pinnacle of squad support firepower, was still struggling to fully absorb. The battle, a desperate fight against overwhelming North Vietnamese Army, NVA forces, had highlighted a glaring deficiency. The sheer, insatiable appetite of the M60 for ammunition was a logistical nightmare. Companies found themselves outgunned not by superior enemy tactics, but by an empty ammunition can. When the NVA closed to within grenade range, the M60s, so potent at 1,000 meters, became unwieldy anchors. Their belts of 100 rounds were depleted in minutes, leaving the soldiers with their M14s outmatched and outgunned. The weight of the deactivated M60s became an unbearable burden, a monument to tactical miscalculation. Moore's report continued starkly. The M60s were left behind, not by choice, by necessity. The ammunition simply wasn't there. We lost good men because a weapon designed to dominate became a dead weight. It was a stark lesson in the unforgiving arithmetic of war. Potential firepower was meaningless without the logistical backbone to sustain it. The M60, a weapon that would define American heavy machine gun capabilities for decades, wasn't born in the heat of battle, but in the sterile environments of engineering labs. A desperate attempt to replicate the success of a proven, albeit enemy, the genesis lay in the legendary German MG-42, a weapon that had sown terror on the battlefields of World War II with its blistering rate of fire. General Electric engineers, tasked with developing a successor to the M14's squad automatic rifle capabilities, looked across the battlefield and saw the efficiency of the MG-42. Their goal, a gas-operated, belt-fed machine gun, chambered in the standard NATO 7.62 by 51 mm round, capable of delivering sustained, suppressive fire. The early prototypes, emerging in the late 1950s, bore a striking resemblance to their German progenitor. They were robust, designed for reliability under harsh conditions, and possessed a savage appetite for ammunition. Initial testing revealed a raw potential, a rate of fire that could be adjusted from a more controlled 950 rounds per minute to an almost uncontrollable 1,100. However, the path to production wasn't without its bumps. Early iterations suffered from overheating issues and a tendency to jam under extreme stress, problems that would dog the weapon's development and, as would become painfully clear, its operational deployment in Vietnam. The engineers strived for a balance between destructive power and battlefield practicality, a delicate equation that the coming conflict would rigorously test. They envisioned a weapon that could pin down an enemy, shatter their morale, and clear the path for advancing infantry. What they couldn't fully anticipate was the sheer, unyielding reality of the Vietnamese landscape, a place where even the most formidable machines could falter. The first time Jenkins truly unleashed Savage, it was a baptism by fire in the humid, suffocating embrace of the Vietnamese jungle. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, vibrated with the M60's thunderous reply. A Viet Cong squad, their faces a blur of determination amidst the dense foliage, had been attempting to flank their entrenched position. The drill sergeant's words echoed in Jenkins' mind as he squeezed the trigger. The first advantage was raw suppression. The M60, spitting out its 7.62 mm rounds at a blistering 950 rounds per minute, transformed the dense bamboo thickets into a storm of splintering wood and shredded leaves. The sheer volume of fire was a physical force, a wall of lead that drove the enemy back, their tentative advance dissolving into panicked retreat. The air itself seemed to hum with the weapon's power. Then came the second advantage: destruction of cover. A cluster of enemy soldiers had taken refuge behind a thick, moss-covered fallen log. Jenkins, tracking the muzzle flash, delivered a sustained burst. The 7.62 mm rounds, imbued with considerable kinetic energy, tore through the decaying wood as if it were tissue paper. The impact a jarring thud that could be felt through the rifle's stock. Dust and debris erupted around the log, and the enemy, exposed and vulnerable, scattered. The third, and perhaps most profound advantage, was the psychological impact. The sound of the M60, a deafening, indiscriminate roar, was unlike anything the enemy had ever encountered. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle or the percussive burst of an automatic weapon. It was a primal, all-consuming noise that clawed at the nerves. A sound that PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez would later describe as the Vietnamese god of fire clearing his throat. It instilled a primal fear, a desperate urge to flee, even before the rounds found their mark. Jenkins felt a strange exhilaration, a sense of raw, unadulterated power coursing through him. He was not just holding a weapon, he was wielding a force of nature. Colonel Thomas Bulldog Sterling, a veteran whose combat experience predated the Vietnam War by decades, offered a tactical assessment in his memoirs. "That damned M60," he'd written, "was a game changer when it worked. I saw one squad hold off an entire MVA company for 7 solid minutes, just pouring fire into the tree line. They chewed through 2,000 rounds doing it, but they held. It was a magnificent, terrifying spectacle." Lower down the chain of command, PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, a man whose primary concern was usually finding dry socks, offered a more visceral perspective. "Man, that M60, he'd grumbled to a fellow grunt over lukewarm sea rations. "That thing's a monster. When it's singin', it's like the devil's own death metal concert. But when it jams, that's when it's a real bastard. You're lugging 1,000 pounds of useless steel and the gooks are all up in your face." For Rodriguez, the M60 was a fickle mistress, capable of saving lives one moment and making a soldier a target the next. Decades after the conflict, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in military technology, provided a post-war analysis. The M60 Minigun represented a quantum leap in squad-level suppressive fire capability, she stated during a televised documentary. Its sustained rate of fire and stopping power were unparalleled by its predecessors. However, its operational effectiveness was frequently hampered by the logistical realities of the jungle. Its weight and ammunition requirements made it ill-suited for rapid maneuver warfare, often turning it into a liability once the enemy closed the distance. Reed's assessment highlighted the critical disconnect between the weapon's theoretical potential and its practical application in the unique theater of war. The M60's arrival in Vietnam was not a seamless integration. It arrived in a theater where other weapons, each with its own proponents and detractors, were already firmly entrenched. The M14, still in wide service at the outset of the conflict, was a capable rifle but lacked the sustained volume of fire necessary for effective suppression against massed enemy assaults. The M16, the future of American infantry, was still finding its feet, plagued by early reliability issues. The paradox of the M60's procurement was stark. The U.S. military ordered tens of thousands of these powerful weapons, yet often struggled to provide adequate ammunition, spare parts, and trained maintenance personnel. This logistical shortfall created a perverse market within the ranks. Ammunition belts, spare barrels, and even cleaning kits became prized commodities, often appearing on the Army's internal black market, exchanged for inflated prices or favors. Soldiers, desperate to keep their formidable weapons operational, would scrounge, trade, or even pilfer to ensure their M60 had the sustenance it needed. The irony was that the very weapon designed to project overwhelming American firepower was often rendered less effective by bureaucratic inertia and the sheer unglamorous challenge of supplying it in a remote, hostile environment. The numbers were impressive on paper. Hundreds of thousands of M60s manufactured, but the true cost was measured in the lives lost when those weapons fell silent, not from enemy action, but from a lack of a simple 100-round belt of ammunition. The colonel's words hung in the humid air, a stark contrast to the sudden, unnerving silence. Sergeant First Class Willie Wrench Jones, his face streaked with grime and sweat, knelt beside the M60. It had jammed, a sickening, metallic choke in the middle of what should have been a continuous roar. The jungle, moments before a symphony of incoming fire and the weapon's thunderous reply, now seemed to hold its breath, amplifying the desperate shouts of the pinned-down platoon. Jenkins, Private First Class Arthur Jenkins, 19 years old and far from the soybean fields of Indiana, watched as Wrench fumbled with the feed tray, his usually steady hands now trembling. The air thrummed with the unspoken question: would Jenkins' Savage, his trusted beast of burden, betray them now? The answer, hanging heavy as the tropical downpour that had just begun, was a terrifying unknown. Back in the sweltering heat of Fort Benning, Georgia, the air in the firing range was thick with the acrid bite of gunpowder and the metallic tang of machine oil. Arthur Jenkins, then a fresh-faced 19-year-old, his hands already calloused from a life of farm work, gripped the M60. It felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight of 23.5 pounds of pure, unadulterated firepower. The drill sergeant's voice, a booming baritone that echoed through the humid air, declared, "Jenkins, this ain't your daddy's hunting rifle. This is the M60. They call her Savage. She's hungry. Feed her right, and she'll sing. Treat her wrong, and she'll bite." Jenkins' first experience with the Savage was a visceral shock. The initial burst, a controlled 3-second splurge that spat out nearly 250 rounds, was a physical assault. The sheer volume of noise, a deafening percussive blast that seemed to vibrate through his very bones, was unlike anything he'd ever imagined. The recoil, a brutal shove that strained his shoulder, was an insistent reminder of the power he wielded. He'd spent hours cleaning and lubricating it that first week, his hands meticulously working over the complex mechanisms, his lips moving in a silent mantra, whispering to the beast, "Come on, old girl, show 'em what you got." He was still naive then, caught up in the romanticized notion of overwhelming firepower, a belief that this metal monster was an invincible instrument of American will. The M60's arrival in Vietnam was not a seamless integration. It arrived in a theater where other weapons, each with its own proponents and detractors, were already firmly entrenched. The M14, still in wide service at the outset of the conflict, was a capable rifle but lacked the sustained volume of fire necessary for effective suppression against massed enemy assaults. The M16, the future of American infantry, was still finding its feet, plagued by early reliability issues. The paradox of the M60's procurement was stark. The U.S. military ordered tens of thousands of these powerful weapons, yet often struggled to provide adequate ammunition, spare parts, and trained maintenance personnel. This logistical shortfall created a perverse market within the ranks. Ammunition belts, spare barrels, and even cleaning kits became prized commodities, often appearing on the Army's internal black market, exchanged for inflated prices or favors. Soldiers, desperate to keep their formidable weapons operational, would scrounge, trade, or even pilfer to ensure their M60 had the sustenance it needed. The irony was that the very weapon designed to project overwhelming American firepower was often rendered less effective by bureaucratic inertia and the sheer, unglamorous challenge of supplying it in a remote, hostile environment. The numbers were impressive on paper, hundreds of thousands of M60s manufactured, but the true cost was measured in the lives lost when those weapons fell silent. Not from enemy action, but from a lack of a simple, 100-round belt of ammunition. The stark reality of the Ia Drang Valley in November 1964 served as a brutal early lesson. Lieutenant General Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, found themselves encircled by overwhelming NVA forces. While the M60's present provided critical suppressive fire, the sheer volume of ammunition required to maintain that defense was unsustainable. Stories emerged of M60 gunners reduced to firing single shots or even using their heavy weapons as clubs when their ammo ran dry. The weapon, designed for sustained fire, became a useless burden, a testament to the disconnect between the materiel requested and the logistical reality of sustained combat. The M60's genesis lay in the ashes of World War II, a testament to the enduring pursuit of overwhelming firepower. Engineers at General Electric, inspired by the legendary German MG-42's devastating rate of fire, sought to create an American equivalent that could unleash a torrent of lead upon enemy formations. The MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw for its chillingly efficient ripping sound, had demonstrated the tactical advantage of sustained automatic fire. GE's designers meticulously studied its mechanisms, adapting the roller-delayed blowback system and adapting it for the more powerful 7.62 by 51mm NATO round. Early prototypes, tested in the late 1950s, showcased a potential rate of fire hovering between 950 to 1,100 rounds per minute. These initial iterations, however, were still rough, often plagued by overheating issues and a tendency to jam. The weapon's effective range, a crucial consideration for infantry support, was pegged at around 1,100 meters, promising devastating engagement capabilities. The initial development was driven by the escalating tensions of the Cold War and the perceived need for a robust, adaptable machine gun that could be fielded across various environments. The goal was simple: to give the American infantrymen a decisive edge in suppressing enemy fire, shattering assaults, and laying down a wall of lead that would make any enemy advance suicidal. Jenkins' first taste of combat with the Savage was a baptism by fire, a brutal symphony of chaos and controlled destruction. They were defending a fire base, dug in against a wave of VC sappers. The enemy, seemingly emerging from the very earth, advanced through the dense undergrowth. Jenkins, his heart hammering against his ribs, unleashed the Savage. The first advantage was immediate: suppression. The sheer volume of fire, a rapid-fire deluge of 950 rounds per minute, tore through the jungle canopy and churned the ground where the enemy attempted to advance. The enemy's coordinated assault dissolved into individual, panicked attempts to find cover, their own weapons silenced by the overwhelming din. The second advantage became apparent as he shifted his aim. The Savage's projectiles, with their considerable muzzle energy, ripped through the thick vegetation, dislodging hidden enemy positions and creating a zone of lethal fire where none existed before. Trees splintered, and the jungle floor became a churned-up wasteland. But it was the third advantage, the psychological impact, that truly struck him. The sound of the M60, a deep guttural roar that seemed to defy the laws of acoustics, was not just noise, it was a physical force. It instilled a primal fear, a sense of impending annihilation that shattered enemy morale. PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, his face pale but his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, later described it. "Man, when that thing starts singing, it's like the whole damn jungle is about to explode. Sounds like a pissed-off tiger mixed with a freight train." The M60's presence on the battlefield was viewed through a prism of vastly different perspectives. Colonel Thomas Sterling, a battle-hardened Marine veteran, recounted in his memoirs, "That beast was a force multiplier. During Operation Prairie, we held a sector against 2 enemy battalions for 7 minutes straight, all thanks to one M60 spitting out 2,000 rounds. It bought us the time we needed to regroup. It wasn't just a weapon, it was the sound of our survival." For PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, a young infantryman who often bore the burden of lugging the heavy machine gun, the M60 was a more visceral, often contradictory experience. "That gun, man," he'd confided to a buddy in a letter home, "she's a beauty when she's working. A real song of death for Charlie. But when she jams, when she decides to take a breather at the wrong damn second, that's when she's a curse. The guy carrying her, he's either the bravest motherfucker on the hill or the dumbest. Or maybe both." Decades after the conflict, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in military technology, provided a post-war analysis. The M60 Minigun represented a quantum leap in squad-level suppressive fire capability, she stated during a televised documentary. Its sustained rate of fire and stopping power were unparalleled by its predecessors. However, its operational effectiveness was frequently hampered by the logistical realities of the jungle. Its weight and ammunition requirements made it ill-suited for rapid maneuver warfare, often turning it into a liability once the enemy closed the distance. Reed's assessment highlighted the critical disconnect between the weapon's theoretical potential and its practical application in the unique theater of war. The M60's arrival in Vietnam was not a seamless integration. It arrived in a theater where other weapons, each with its own proponents and detractors, were already firmly entrenched. The M14, still in wide service at the outset of the conflict, was a capable rifle but lacked the sustained volume of fire necessary for effective suppression against massed enemy assaults. The M16, the future of American infantry, was still finding its feet, plagued by early reliability issues. The paradox of the M60's procurement was stark. The U.S. military ordered tens of thousands of these powerful weapons, yet often struggled to provide adequate ammunition, spare parts, and trained maintenance personnel. This logistical shortfall created a perverse market within the ranks. Ammunition belts, spare barrels, and even cleaning kits became prized commodities, often appearing on the Army's internal black market, exchanged for inflated prices or favors. Soldiers, desperate to keep their formidable weapons operational, would scrounge, trade, or even pilfer to ensure their M60 had the sustenance it needed. The irony was that the very weapon designed to project overwhelming American firepower was often rendered less effective by bureaucratic inertia and the sheer unglamorous challenge of supplying it in a remote, hostile environment. The numbers were impressive on paper. Hundreds of thousands of M60s manufactured, but the true cost was measured in the lives lost when those weapons fell silent, not from enemy action, but from a lack of a simple 100-round belt of ammunition. From the other side of the jungle's emerald curtain, the M60 was a terror, a force to be reckoned with, but not an insurmountable one. Lao Dio Ho, the Old Falcon, as his men called him, commander of a Viet Cong company, described the sound of the M60 as the roar of a furious tiger. He understood its power, its ability to shred through cover and sow panic. "When that sound comes," he'd explained to his lieutenants during a pre-dawn briefing, his voice a low rasp, "the Americans think they are safe behind their wall of fire. They feel strong, but the tiger can be outsmarted. Its strength is also its weakness." His tactics revolved around negating the M60's advantage. He trained his men to use the dense undergrowth, the tangled vines and thick canopy as their shield and sword. "We move in shadows close to the earth," he instructed. "We get within 20 meters, 15, before they can properly aim. They spray their fire, but they cannot see us. Then we strike." He had witnessed his own soldiers fall, mown down by the savages' insatiable hunger, but he had also seen opportunities. If the Americans were dug in, they would advance under smoke, using the thick, acrid clouds to mask their approach, closing the distance before the M60 could be effectively brought to bear. In extreme situations, when facing a particularly stubborn M60 emplacement, he had been known to employ less conventional methods. The use of captured civilians, or even villagers caught in the crossfire, as human shields was a grim tactic, a desperate measure to force the American gunners to cease their devastating fire, to make them hesitate. It was a cruel testament to the enemy's adaptability and their willingness to exploit any advantage, any weakness, in the face of such overwhelming firepower. The M60 Minigun, despite its formidable reputation, was also a creature of myth. One pervasive myth was that it could fire continuously for hours, an unending stream of liberation. This was far from the truth. Sustained fire beyond a few hundred rounds would rapidly overheat the barrel, glowing cherry red and threatening to ignite surrounding foliage. Another myth was that it was solely a defensive weapon. While its suppressive capabilities were unparalleled for static defense, forward observers and assault teams discovered its offensive potential, using its sustained fire to breach enemy positions and provide moving cover for advancing infantry. The true paradox, however, was that the M60 was simultaneously a symbol of American firepower and a logistical nightmare. It was the ultimate expression of American industrial might, capable of delivering unprecedented destruction. Yet its effective deployment was constantly hampered by the sheer difficulty and expense of supplying it with enough ammunition and trained personnel in the remote and challenging environment of Vietnam. The M60's effectiveness, while undeniable, was tempered by a trio of critical shortcomings that haunted its users in the humid hell of Vietnam. Overheating was a constant and dangerous adversary. After a sustained burst of 200 to 300 rounds, the barrel could reach temperatures so extreme that it would glow a menacing orange, capable of igniting dry grass and jungle brush, turning a defensive position into a blazing inferno. Jenkins himself had witnessed this firsthand during an operation near Khe Sanh. A stray spark from his own savage, coupled with the dry vegetation, had caused a patch of jungle to erupt in flames, drawing enemy attention and forcing a hasty repositioning. Secondly, the M60 proved notoriously sensitive to the elements. The humid air, the pervasive moisture, and the fine red dust of Vietnam conspired to gum up its intricate mechanisms. Frequently, the weapon would jam, choked by mud and dampness, turning the once mighty savage into a useless, heavy burden. Jenkins' most harrowing experience with this flaw occurred during that same monsoon downpour on the Cambodian border. As he desperately tried to clear a jam, the rain washing over him, he felt a chilling sense of vulnerability, the savage stubbornly refusing to cooperate. Finally, the limited ammunition capacity presented a constant tactical challenge. A standard ammunition belt held only 100 rounds, a mere blink in the M60's rapid-fire cycle. This necessitated frequent and often dangerous reloads in the heat of battle, exposing the gunner and his assistants to enemy fire as they wrestled with spare belts and feed tray covers. Despite these significant drawbacks, the M60 remained a cornerstone of American infantry tactics. Its sheer suppressive power, too valuable to abandon, even with the inherent risks and logistical headaches it presented. Their ammunition was depleted faster than resupply could manage. The M60, in these scenarios, transformed from a thunderous harbinger of doom to a dead weight, an embarrassing testament to logistical failure. The chilling realization dawned on commanders and grunts alike. While the M60 could unleash hell, keeping that hell contained and fed was a monumental task that the jungles of Vietnam often made impossible. This inherent disconnect between the weapon's raw potential and the practicalities of its employment in such a brutal theater became one of its most defining and often tragic characteristics. The genesis of the M60, affectionately nicknamed the Pig by some, or more ominously Savage by others, was rooted in a desire to replicate the battlefield dominance enjoyed by the Germans with their MG-42 during World War II. Engineers at General Electric, tasked with developing a successor to the M1918 Browning automatic rifle R and various other light machine gun designs, looked to the German weapon's high rate of fire and reliable design as the benchmark. The MG-42, with its infamous buzzsaw sound and devastatingly high cyclic rate of 1,200–1,500 rounds per minute, had proven how a sustained, heavy volume of fire could shatter enemy formations. The goal for the M60 was to achieve a similar suppressive capability, but within an American doctrinal framework, utilizing the standard NATO 7.62 by 51 mm round. Early prototypes, developed in the mid-1950s, began to take shape, incorporating features like a quick-change barrel and a belt feed mechanism inspired by, but not identical to, the MG-42. Initial trials were promising, hinting at the immense firepower the new weapon could bring. The engineers were pushing the boundaries of what a man-portable machine gun could achieve, aiming for a balance between portability, sustained fire, and devastating effect. They envisioned a weapon that could arm a single soldier with the firepower of a small support team, a mobile gun platform that could dominate any engagement. PFC Arthur Art Jenkins' first baptism by fire with the Savage was not the glorious, controlled display of power he had naively imagined. It was a desperate, chaotic defense against a Viet Cong assault near the Laotian border. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant gunpowder, crackled with the frantic shouts of his comrades. As the enemy probes intensified, Jenkins was ordered to lay down suppressing fire. He flipped the Savage onto its bipod, squeezed the trigger, and the world erupted. The sheer volume of fire was intoxicating, a physical force that seemed to push back the jungle itself. Advantage 1: suppression of enemy fire. With a cyclic rate of approximately 950 rounds per minute, Jenkins unleashed a torrent of 7.62 mm rounds, blanketing the tree line from which the enemy was attacking. The rhythmic thunder of his weapon, a deafening roar that dwarfed the crackle of individual rifle shots, forced the attackers to duck and cover, their own volleys faltering and then ceasing. The enemy, caught in the open, broke ranks, their attack faltering under the overwhelming barrage. Jenkins felt a surge of adrenaline, the savage a living entity in his hands, responding to his every command. Later, during a patrol through particularly dense terrain, the savage proved its worth again. Advantage 2: destruction of enemy cover. The Viet Cong had established firing positions within the thick undergrowth, their camouflaged positions offering substantial protection. Jenkins, under the direction of his squad leader, used the savages' sustained fire to chew through the dense foliage and the rudimentary earthworks the enemy had constructed. Rounds tore through bamboo thickets and shattered branches, dislodging hidden adversaries and forcing them into the open, where the rest of the squad could engage them effectively. The sheer kinetic energy of the bullets, coupled with the volume of fire, rendered their cover useless. But perhaps the most profound advantage was the psychological impact. Advantage 3: psychological effect on the enemy. The first time the enemy heard the savage unleashed in a sustained burst, panic rippled through their ranks. It wasn't just the sound of bullets, it was a visceral, unceasing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Stories circulated among the troops of enemy soldiers surrendering immediately upon hearing the savage, or of entire squads breaking and running at its approach. PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, a wiry kid from the Bronx, once described it to Jenkins with a grim chuckle. "Man, that gun sounds like a pissed-off god throwing rocks at hell. You hear that, and you know it ain't going to be a good day for Charlie." This sheer terror, this overwhelming sonic assault, was as much a weapon as the bullets themselves. Colonel Thomas Bulldog Sterling, a battle-hardened Marine who had transitioned to command an Army infantry battalion, recounted in his memoirs. "There was a fire base, LZ Starlight, under heavy assault. We were running low on everything, but the M60s, bless their heavy hearts, kept spitting lead. For 7 solid minutes, those belt-fed behemoths chewed up the jungle, consuming nearly 2,000 rounds. They didn't stop the assault cold, but they bought us time. Time to reinforce, time to regroup. That's the M60's story. It buys you time at a cost." This perspective from the command echelon highlighted the weapon's strategic value in static defensive situations. On a different spectrum, PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, who often found himself near the savage crews, offered a more visceral, ground-level assessment. "That gun," Sticks would say, gesturing with a half-smoked cigarette, "she's a hell of a song when she's singing. A real death anthem. But when she coughs, when she jams, man, then it's just a curse. A heavy metal curse that's got you pinned down, too. You hear that rumble, you know something's about to go down. Good or bad, you just don't know till she quits singing." This duality, the awe and the dread, was a constant companion for those in earshot. Decades later, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a military historian whose doctoral thesis focused on infantry support weapons, offered a more academic, detached analysis. The M60 represented a quantum leap in automatic fire capability for the American infantry platoon, she stated in a post-war lecture. Its sustained fire rate, coupled with the potent 7.62 mm round, gave it an unparalleled ability to suppress enemy positions and provide area denial. However, its significant weight and ammunition logistics made it ill-suited for the highly mobile, guerrilla-style warfare prevalent in Vietnam. It was a weapon designed for open fields and set-piece battles, not the dense, unforgiving jungle. The M60 was not the only automatic weapon fielded by the U.S. Army during the conflict, nor was it the first attempt at a modern battle rifle. The M14, a powerful rifle chambered in 7.62 millimeters, was still in use at the beginning of the war, but its selective fire capability was often considered too difficult for the average soldier to control effectively without significant training, and its weight was also a factor. The M16, chambered in a smaller 5.56 millimeter round, was rapidly being introduced, promising lighter weight and higher capacity magazines, though it initially suffered from reliability issues of its own. The paradox of the M60's procurement was stark. Enormous quantities were ordered and shipped to Vietnam, reflecting the perceived need for its firepower. Yet, the logistical tail required to support these weapons was often a fraction of what was actually needed. Ammunition convoys were prime targets for ambush, and the sheer volume required for sustained M60 fire strained supply lines to their breaking point. This scarcity created a grim black market within the Army itself. Soldiers desperate for ammunition belts or replacement parts would find them available through unofficial channels, often at exorbitant prices paid in cigarettes, whiskey, or favors. The irony was that the Army was spending vast sums to equip its soldiers with the M60, only to see its effectiveness blunted by a lack of resources that, in real terms, cost far more in lost lives and denied objectives than the ammunition itself would have. It sounds like the roar of a maddened tiger, the Viet Cong officer known as Lo Deo Ho, Old Kite Hawk, would later recount through an interpreter. When we hear that sound, we know the Americans are dug in, spitting fire. It causes fear, yes, but it also tells us where they are. It is a loud, predictable thing. We learn to use the thick jungle, the canals, the fog to get close. 15, 20 meters, close enough to throw grenades, to use our bayonets. The sound makes the young ones panic, but for us, it is a signal to be patient, to wait for the brief moments between bursts, to use the terrain. He described tactics where his men would move under the cover of dense foliage, sometimes feigning retreat to draw the American gunners into exposing their positions, only to emerge from unexpected directions. In more desperate situations, to counter the overwhelming firepower of the savage, his units were forced to employ brutal tactics. Sometimes, he admitted with a chilling pragmatism, we would use the villagers, the women and children caught between us. They were not shields, but they were complications for the Americans. They would not fire upon innocent lives. It was a difficult choice, but survival demanded difficult choices. This stark perspective from the opposing side revealed the M60 not as an invincible force, but as a predictable element that could be understood, countered, and even exploited by a determined and adaptable enemy. The M60 minigun was a weapon shrouded in myths, many of which stemmed from its awe-inspiring capabilities and the intense experiences of those who wielded it. One prevalent myth was that the M60 could fire continuously for hours, an unstoppable river of lead. In reality, while its belt-fed system allowed for sustained fire far longer than any assault rifle, the barrel would overheat dramatically after only a few hundred rounds, requiring a change or a lengthy cooling period. Another common misconception was that the M60 was solely a defensive weapon, designed to hold positions. While it excelled at this, its offensive potential was also immense. Forward observers and assault teams discovered its offensive capabilities, using its sustained fire to breach enemy positions and provide moving cover for advancing infantry. The true paradox, however, was that the M60 was simultaneously a symbol of American firepower and a logistical nightmare. It was the ultimate expression of American industrial might, capable of delivering unprecedented destruction. Yet its effective deployment was constantly hampered by the sheer difficulty and expense of supplying it with enough ammunition and trained personnel in the remote and challenging environment of Vietnam. The M60's effectiveness, while undeniable, was tempered by a trio of critical shortcomings that haunted its users in the humid hell of Vietnam. Overheating was a constant and dangerous adversary. After a sustained burst of 200 to 300 rounds, the barrel could reach temperatures so extreme that it would glow a menacing orange, capable of igniting dry grass and jungle brush, turning a defensive position into a blazing inferno. Jenkins himself had witnessed this firsthand during an operation near Khe Sanh. A stray spark from his own savage, coupled with the dry vegetation, had caused a patch of jungle to erupt in flames, drawing enemy attention and forcing a hasty repositioning. Secondly, the M60 proved notoriously sensitive to the elements. The humid air, the pervasive moisture, and the fine red dust of Vietnam conspired to gum up its intricate mechanisms. Frequently, the weapon would jam, choked by mud and dampness, turning the once mighty Savage into a useless, heavy burden. Jenkins' most harrowing experience with this flaw occurred during that same monsoon downpour on the Cambodian border. As he desperately tried to clear a jam, the rain washing over him, he felt a chilling sense of vulnerability, the Savage stubbornly refusing to cooperate. Finally, the limited ammunition capacity presented a constant tactical challenge. A standard ammunition belt held only 100 rounds, a mere blink in the M60's rapid-fire cycle. This necessitated frequent and often dangerous reloads in the heat of battle, exposing the gunner and his assistants to enemy fire as they wrestled with spare belts and feed tray covers. Despite these significant drawbacks, the M60 remained a cornerstone of American infantry tactics, its sheer suppressive power too valuable to abandon, even with the inherent risks and logistical headaches it presented. The M60 Minigun, though indelibly linked to Vietnam, did not vanish with the end of the conflict. It continued to serve in various roles and across numerous theaters, evolving through several iterations. The M60E3, introduced in the 1980s, sought to improve ergonomics and reduce weight. Later, the M60E4, also designated in 43, offered further enhancements, including a shorter barrel option and improved reliability, making it more adaptable to naval and special operations use. The fundamental principle it embodied, a high rate of fire for overwhelming suppression, continued to influence weapon design. Modern machine guns, from the FN Mag to the M240 and even squad automatic weapons, owe a lineage to the design concepts explored and proven by the M60. Its legacy is not just in its physical form, but in the tactical doctrine it helped shape. The idea that a single soldier could wield substantial suppressive firepower, a concept that remains central to infantry support roles today. The M60 became a precursor, a stepping stone to the automatic weapons that continue to define modern warfare. SSG. Wrench Willie Jones, his hands permanently stained with grease and smelling faintly of gun oil, sat, hunched over a workbench in a dimly lit armory at Fort Campbell in 1975. Before him lay a Savage, its once olive-drab finish scarred and faded, a grim souvenir from the jungles of Vietnam. He was trying to breathe life back into it, a familiar, almost sacred ritual. He meticulously disassembled the weapon, each screw, spring, and pin placed with practiced precision. Then came the moment of truth. He found the source of a persistent jamming issue that had plagued this particular unit in the field. His fingers traced a worn groove on a small, unassuming component, a part he had painstakingly ensured was manufactured to exact specifications. But as he fitted a new, precisely machined replacement, he noticed a subtle difference in the metal's grain, a faint softness that wasn't present in the original, unblemished parts he had been issued years ago. The critical part, the one that bore the brunt of the bolt carrier's travel, had been made from a metal alloy that was slightly too soft. Under the immense pressures and heat of sustained fire, it had begun to deform, imperceptibly at first, then gradually, creating just enough friction, just enough of a deviation to cause unpredictable jams. Whispers of the gods, he'd called his custom lubricant, believing his meticulous application could overcome any mechanical flaw. Now, staring at the deformed metal, he felt a profound sense of disillusionment. His whispers couldn't rewrite metallurgy. He saw the crudely etched initials AJ on the receiver cover, recognizing the faint markings from a previous inspection. This Savage had belonged to someone who had fought and bled with it. Someone who had relied on its thunderous roar, only to have it fall silent at the worst possible moment. The realization struck him with the force of a spent casing. His own dedication, his own meticulous craftsmanship, had been undermined by a fundamental flaw in the weapon's very construction, a flaw that had likely cost lives, perhaps even the life of this Jenkins. Arthur Art Jenkins, now a man weathered by sun and time, walked the fields of his family farm in rural Indiana. His hands, still calloused and strong, now worked with the familiar heft of a plow and the steady rhythm of a tractor engine. A far cry from the Savage he once wielded. The war had left its indelible mark, not just on his memory, but on his body. A thin, silvery scar traced a path across his right shoulder, a permanent reminder of a fragment that had found its mark during a frantic firefight. He rarely spoke of Vietnam, but the echoes of the jungle remained. He would sometimes wake in the pre-dawn quiet, the phantom roar of the M60 still thrumming in his ears, only to be soothed by the chirping of crickets. One sweltering afternoon, while repairing a fence, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked down at his hands, at the deep lines etched into his palms, and a faint smile touched his lips. "I saw it roar," he murmured, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. "I felt it, and I know it could kill and it could save, but sometimes it just stayed quiet when it was supposed to speak." The quiet was a sound he had come to understand, a silence that spoke volumes about the unpredictable nature of war and the machines that waged it. On the damp, red earth near the Cambodian border in 1968, PFC Jenkins lay prone, the unrelenting rain plastering his uniform to his skin. His fingers fumbled with the savage, desperately trying to clear a jam that had silenced its thunderous song at the most critical moment. The shouts of his comrades, the crackle of enemy fire, it all faded into a single, overwhelming sound. It was that same deafening, incomprehensible roar he remembered, the one that had once promised power, but now seemed filled with a guttural, mechanical despair. He heard it again, not as the voice of a god of fire, but as the raw, unyielding sound of metal protesting beyond its limits, a symphony of failure played out in springs, pins, and flawed alloys. It was the sound of machinery breaking. Slowly, deliberately, his calloused, mud-caked hand lowered the useless savage into the yielding earth. The gentle hiss of the rain, now a steady downpour, washed over the fallen weapon, and over him, muffling all other sounds until only the relentless rhythm of the water remained. On the damp, red earth near the Cambodian border in 1968, PFC Jenkins lay prone, the unrelenting rain plastering his uniform to his skin. His fingers fumbled with the savage, desperately trying to clear a jam that had silenced its thunderous song at the most critical moment. The shouts of his comrades, the crackle of enemy fire, it all faded into a single, overwhelming sound. It was that same deafening, incomprehensible roar he remembered, the one that had once promised power, but now seemed filled with a guttural, mechanical despair. He heard it again, not as the voice of a god of fire, but as the raw, unyielding sound of metal protesting beyond its limits, a symphony of failure played out in springs, pins, and flawed alloys. It was the sound of machinery breaking. Slowly, deliberately, his calloused, mud-caked hand lowered the useless savage into the yielding earth. The gentle hiss of the rain, now a steady downpour, washed over the fallen weapon, and over him, muffling all other sounds until only the relentless rhythm of the water remained. Fort Benning, Georgia, 1966. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil, sweat, and the distant metallic tang of spent brass. 19-year-old Arthur Art Jenkins, his hands already showing the deep lines of a farm boy's labor, stood before the savage, the M60. It was an imposing beast, 23.4 pounds of raw American might, devoid of its ammunition belt. He'd been told it was the infantry's teeth, a tool of overwhelming force. As he hefted it, the sheer weight settled into his shoulders, a tangible pressure that belied its potential to unleash hell. His drill sergeant, a man whose voice seemed permanently set to a gravelly rasp, watched him with impassive eyes. "Jenkins," he'd barked earlier that week, his words laced with a hint of prophecy, "you treat this weapon like it's your bride, and it'll keep you alive. Neglect her, and she'll leave you for dead." Art's ritual began. He'd unscrew the gas cylinder, a faint click echoing in the quiet bay. The smell of CLP, a chemical blend that spoke of readiness and protection, filled his nostrils. He'd meticulously clean each part, his fingers moving with a practiced, almost tender precision, wiping away any hint of dust or grime. He called it Savage. He whispered to it, "Come on, old man, show 'em what you got." It was a naive notion, born of the sterile efficiency of training, that this machine, his Savage, could simply be willed into perfection, that its roar was a promise of victory. He didn't yet understand the language of its silence. The Ia Drang Valley, November 1964. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, pulsed with the distant chatter of small arms fire. Sergeant Major John Thunder O'Malley, a veteran of Korea with eyes that had seen too much, watched his men struggle. Their objective: suppress an enemy machine gun nest dug into the dense triple canopy jungle. They had the M60s, the pigs, spitting lead at a rate that could shred a tin can at 100 yards. But the jungle was a voracious eater of ammunition. Within minutes, the belts were depleted. The M60s, once roaring lions, became inert, heavy burdens. The Viet Cong, masters of close quarters combat and the terrain, simply melted back into the foliage, their AK-47s spitting defiance. O'Malley's report, later filed with a weary sigh, would state, "The M60 provides unparalleled suppression capability, but only when sustained fire is possible." In Ia Drang, the limited supply chain rendered the weapon a tactical liability once close engagement occurred. We paid for every round, and we paid in blood. It was a stark illustration of the disconnect between the theoretical power of the M60 and the brutal logistical realities of Vietnam. Training manuals spoke of suppression and devastating firepower. The reality was a desperate scramble for ammunition, a grim race against time, and an enemy who knew how to exploit every weakness. The M60's lineage was born from the ashes of World War II, a testament to the relentless pursuit of firepower. In the late 1950s, engineers at General Electric, led by a visionary named Jim Sullivan, looked to the legendary German MG-42. Its dished belt feed and rapid rate of fire had terrified Allied soldiers. Sullivan and his team aimed to create an American counterpart, something that could deliver a sustained, high-volume stream of .30 caliber lead. They adapted the German design, incorporating a quick-change barrel to prevent overheating and a gas-operated system that was, in theory, robust and reliable. The initial prototypes, tested in the arid landscapes of American firing ranges, showed immense promise. They were dubbed the Universal Machine Gun due to their intended role as both a light and medium machine gun. The 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round offered significant range and penetration compared to lighter calibers. The goal was clear, a weapon that could project overwhelming force, a mobile thunderclap that would dominate any battlefield. The whispers of a brewing conflict in Southeast Asia provided the crucible for this new weapon. Jenkins' first taste of combat was a baptism by fire in the Central Highlands, 1967. The air was thick with the stench of cordite and the acrid bite of fear. A North Vietnamese army unit had launched a probing attack on their firebase, a desperate attempt to breach the perimeter. The M60, his Savage, was mounted on a tripod, spitting its fury into the encroaching darkness. The first advantage was immediate: suppression. The sheer volume of fire, nearly 950 rounds per minute, slammed into the jungle, tearing through bamboo and vines, making it impossible for the enemy to advance or even aim. The crackle of their rifles faltered under the M60's roar. Later that day, pinned down by enemy fire from a well-concealed bunker, Jenkins unleashed the second advantage: destruction of enemy cover. The M60's rounds, heavy and energetic, chewed through the reinforced earth and timber of the bunker, sending dirt and debris flying. The enemy's haven became their tomb. But perhaps the most profound advantage was the psychological impact. The M60's sound was unlike anything else. PFC Bobby Sticks Rodriguez, a wiry kid from Brooklyn who carried the ammunition for Jenkins' Beast, described it later in a letter home. "Man, when that thing screams, it ain't just a gun. It's like the damn sky is breaking open, and the whole world is coming down on them. Makes you feel like a god or a demon." It was a sound that instilled panic, a visceral terror that could shatter enemy morale before the bullets even found their mark. The M60's reputation was built on a foundation of both awe and frustration, a duality captured by the men who wielded and faced it. Colonel Thomas Bulldog Sterling, a grizzled Marine veteran, recounted in his memoirs, "We had a company pinned down by 3 NVA machine gun nests. For 7 agonizing minutes, our M60, with its hungry maw devouring 2,000 rounds, held them at bay. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a defiant roar against the inevitable, a shield forged in brass and fire." This was the elite perspective, the tactical overview of a commander who saw the M60 as a force multiplier. At the ground level, PFC Rodriguez offered a more visceral, street-level assessment. "That Savage," he'd say, wiping sweat from his brow, "she's a killer when she's happy. But when she ain't, she's a goddamn anchor. You hear her singing, you know you're doing something right. You hear her coughing, you better be praying." This was the grunt's perspective, the lived experience of the man intimately connected to the weapon's capricious nature. Post-war analysis, however, offered a more dispassionate view. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in military technology, stated, "The M60 minigun represented a significant leap in sustained firepower over earlier light machine guns. Its 30 caliber round possessed superior range and penetration. However, its weight and logistical demands, particularly the need for a dedicated ammunition bearer and its susceptibility to environmental factors, made it less suited for the highly mobile jungle warfare the U.S. forces were often engaged in." This was the expert's calibrated judgment, acknowledging both the power and the inherent limitations. The M60's introduction coincided with a complex landscape of American small arms. The M14, a robust but heavy battle rifle, was still in service, often proving too cumbersome for rapid jungle maneuvers. The M16, lighter and more advanced in its materials, was being introduced, but its early teething problems, particularly its unreliability in the wet Vietnamese climate, were well documented. The paradox of the M60 was its sheer proliferation. Thousands were churned out and shipped to Vietnam. Yet the logistical tail to support them was often woefully inadequate. Ammunition, the lifeblood of any machine gun, was frequently scarce, leading to the grim reality of M60s becoming useless dead weight. This scarcity fueled a dark undercurrent within the military, a thriving black market for ammunition and spare parts. Soldiers would sometimes trade cigarettes, captured enemy equipment, or even a portion of their meager pay for a belt of 7.62mm rounds or a crucial replacement part. The irony was stark. The U.S. Army was investing millions in a weapon designed for overwhelming firepower, while its effectiveness was routinely crippled by the mundane bureaucracy of requisition and supply, a system that often prioritized paperwork over battlefield necessity, ultimately costing more in lives than any black market markup. The enemy commander, known as Old Falcon, watched from the dense foliage, his face etched with a grim respect. He'd heard the M60 before. His men called it the Devil's Fire Hose. "It is a sound," he'd explained to his lieutenants, his voice a low rumble, "that turns brave men into rabbits, a deafening roar that seems to swallow the jungle whole. But it is a predictable roar." His tactics were born from this understanding. He knew that the M60, while powerful, had limitations. Its weight made it difficult to relocate quickly. Its sustained fire, while devastating, could also betray its position. He trained his men to use the thick undergrowth as a cloak, to approach within 15 to 20 meters, to move like shadows in the early morning mist or the late afternoon twilight. Their strategy wasn't to match the M60's firepower, but to negate it by getting too close, by forcing the American gunner to choose between firing and hitting his own men, or by using smoke grenades to disorient and then striking with satchel charges. He understood that fear was a potent weapon, but it had to be managed. He'd even employed the abhorrent tactic of using human shields, forcing the American soldiers to cease fire for a heart-stopping moment, a moment that could be decisive. 3 myths surrounding the M60 persistently clung to the weapon like jungle rot. The first and most enduring was that the M60 could fire continuously for hours. This was a dangerous fantasy. While the quick-change barrel allowed for sustained firing, prolonged bursts of 200 to 300 rounds would rapidly heat the barrel to the point where it could ignite nearby vegetation, a terrifying spectacle in the dry season. The second myth was that the M60 was exclusively a defensive weapon. While its stationary capabilities were undeniable, it was also employed in offensive roles, mounted on helicopters, APCs, and even carried by specialized infantry units tasked with clearing enemy positions, a role that placed extreme demands on both the gunner and the ammunition bearer. The third, and most poignant, was the paradox that the M60 was both the ultimate symbol of American industrial might and the source of its most debilitating logistical headaches. Its very power, the insatiable hunger for ammunition, was its Achilles heel, a truth that was as undeniable as the sweat on a soldier's brow. The M60's operational life in Vietnam was a testament to its robust design and the grim necessity of its presence, but it was not without its critical shortcomings. The first, and most visually dramatic, was overheating. After sustained firing, particularly in the dense, dry jungles, The barrel could glow cherry red, capable of igniting the surrounding brush. There were documented instances of entire fire bases being shrouded in smoke, not from enemy action, but from the M60s themselves setting the jungle ablaze. Secondly, the weapon was notoriously sensitive to dirt and moisture. The humid, tropical environment of Vietnam was its nemesis. Fine red dust, insidious moisture, and the constant threat of rain could clog the delicate mechanisms, leading to frustrating and often fatal jams. Jenkins himself had spent agonizing minutes on his hands and knees under a torrential downpour, desperately trying to clear a jammed Savage, the sound of enemy fire closing in, the weapon's silence more terrifying than its roar. The third, and perhaps most persistent, was its limited ammunition capacity per belt. Typically 100 rounds, this necessitated frequent and vulnerable reloads in the heat of battle. A skilled gunner could empty a belt in mere seconds, leaving him exposed and defenseless while his ammunition bearer scrambled to connect a new one, a process that felt like an eternity when the enemy was pressing. Despite its flaws, the M60's operational life extended far beyond Vietnam. It saw service in numerous other conflicts, evolving through modifications like the M60E3 and the M60E4, which addressed some of its ergonomic and reliability issues. The core principle of its design, delivering a high-volume, sustained stream of fire for suppression, became the bedrock for countless subsequent machine gun designs, both American and foreign. Its silhouette, once a common sight in military arsenals worldwide, continued to represent a potent force, a symbol of firepower that could be projected across a battlefield. Even today, the fundamental philosophy of the M60's role, to lay down a wall of lead that an enemy could not penetrate, is a cornerstone of modern infantry tactics. In the dimly lit maintenance bay at Fort Campbell in 1975, SSG, Wrench Willie Jones meticulously worked on a Savage, a veteran of countless firefights in the Vietnamese jungles. It was scarred, battered, but he treated it with the same reverence he always had. This particular weapon had been returned from a demobilization unit, its condition a testament to the harsh realities of war. As he disassembled the receiver, his practiced hands tracing the familiar contours, he noticed something amiss. A critical bolt in the firing mechanism, one he'd always carefully lubricated with his special blend, was showing signs of premature wear, a subtle deformation that explained the intermittent jamming he'd heard about from returning soldiers. He pulled out his micrometer, his brow furrowed. The tolerance was off. The metal, he realized with a sickening lurch, was softer than it should have been, a cheapened alloy used in a desperate bid to cut costs during later production runs. His whisper of the gods, his secret lubricant, couldn't overcome a fundamental material flaw. He traced the wear pattern, understanding how it led to misfeeds, to the weapon's frustrating silence when it should have roared. He looked at the scratched inscription on the receiver, Savage, and a chill ran down his spine. He knew this weapon belonged to someone who had relied on it, someone who had perhaps faced the ultimate consequence of its failure. The weight of that realization settled heavily upon him, a burden far heavier than any weapon. Back in Indiana, the sun beat down on Art Jenkins's weathered face as he mended a fence. His hands, once accustomed to the cold, heavy steel of the M60, now moved with the familiar roughness of wood and wire. The scar on his shoulder, a pale reminder of the jungle's fury, itched under the summer heat. He paused, leaning on his hammer, and looked out at the endless fields. He saw the Savage not as a weapon of war, but as a force of nature, a magnificent, terrible thing. "I saw it roar," he murmured, the words a quiet exhalation. "I felt it, and I know it could kill, and it could save. But sometimes it just stayed quiet when it was supposed to speak." That quiet, he had learned, was a language of its own, a testament to the unpredictable dance between man and machine, a dance that often ended in a silence more profound than any explosion. On the damp red earth near the Cambodian border in 1968, PFC Jenkins lay prone, the unrelenting rain plastering his uniform to his skin. His fingers fumbled with the Savage, desperately trying to clear a jam that had silenced its thunderous song at the most critical moment. The shouts of his comrades, the crackle of enemy fire, it all faded into a single, overwhelming sound. It was that same deafening, incomprehensible roar he remembered, the one that had once promised power, but now seemed filled with a guttural, mechanical despair. He heard it again, not as the voice of a god of fire, but as the raw, unyielding sound of metal protesting beyond its limits, a symphony of failure played out in springs, pins, and flawed alloys. It was the sound of machinery breaking. Slowly, deliberately, his calloused, mud-caked hand lowered the useless savage into the yielding earth. The gentle hiss of the rain, now a steady downpour, washed over the fallen weapon, and over him, muffling all other sounds until only the relentless rhythm of the water remained. The savage had fallen silent. It was a quiet that spoke not of victory, but of the cold, hard logic of metal fatigue and the inherent vulnerability of even the most powerful tools when pushed beyond their breaking point.